Hello, and welcome to the Richter scale, where we look at books that have made an impact on my life and books that have made a resounding impact in the world. As long as a book meets the criteria of about a 10.9 on the Richter scale, it is getting a Richter report, a little bit of insight into your uh, reason for reading this book. And even if you don't read this book, just I want to give as much attention to this book in this time because I truly believe that this is a book that every single person should know about. If you choose not to read it, I'm going to challenge you to the next time you're at a dinner party or a lunch or a phone call or a Zoom meeting, drop the name of this book into that conversation because this is how much the world needs to hear about this book. So, on today's Richter scale, the 10.9 on the Richter scale today is The Happiest Man on Earth by Eddie Jaku. He is it's the subtitle is The Beautiful Life of an Auschwitz Survivor. And now here is why Eddie Jaku actually this is although this is an autobiography or really a memoir, Eddie Jaku actually has the unique position of actually being able to give this memoir almost as a prescriptive nonfiction. He's actually able to allow the reader to actually take notes out of this because, after all, the premise is the happiest man on earth. It's not just a memoir, he's actually teaching you how it is that an Auschwitz survivor with that kind of history, how it is that he is possible to claim to be the happiest man on earth. A few elements ring really true for this book. Very often with nonfiction books, I'm underlining and highlighting and dog earing. This book actually felt a little bit too holy, a little too much from my heart would be taken up if I actually marked this up. So I kept it in its integrity. I kept it without dog earing it or anything. But a few things as he was telling, as Eddie Jaku was telling about the story of his childhood, it's amazing to me to think because we know what happened. Now looking back on history, we know what the precursor was. We know what to look for and what to expect and what his family didn't. The amazing thing to read with The Happiest Man on Earth and other accounts like this is that for Eddie Jaku's family in the 1930s, they actually had no idea what was on the horizon. Just get that. They didn't have any history to be able to look back and say, well, we better watch out for this. And we've seen this kind of totalitarian regime. We've seen this kind of manipulation of the media. We've seen this kind of um, public relations stunts being done before. They actually had no idea. It was consider a very modern time in the history of the world. There wasn't a way to mass market media previous to that. There wasn't movie theaters to project political opinion to the masses. That they didn't have a way to create sort of like what we would call today a viral sensation. It was new at the time. And so here was Eddie Jaku's family, which of course he explains that that's a name that he took on as an anglicized name. But here was Eddie Jaku's family, just normal European family. He grew up, and his when it was first started to be the ripples of anti-Semitism that were impinging on their lives, his father sent him away. Get this. At 13 years old, his father decided to send him away under false identity with false papers to a boarding school to pretend to be an orphan and to live in this boarding school as the only person there who was parentless, even though he had parents. He was there under a false identity with false papers. So the fact that he was lying and saying he was an orphan just to go to school meant that he couldn't even go home for the summer holidays or for the winter holidays, or um, he couldn't even share with his parents anything to do with his grades or in when children today go to let's say a campus, an overnight camp, their parents send them care packages and different things. He couldn't even lean on his parents in any way for that. There could be no communication. The only communication that he had was in the rare occasion where he would go to the uh, department store, the payphone of a department store. And of course, in those days, it wasn't that you just put a coin in, or it wasn't anonymous. He would have to go to the department store and ask the operator to patch him through, and that operator from his hometown would patch that call through. So he had to go far away. On a weekend, on a Sunday, he had to go far away from the town where he was positioned for that uh, schooling, far, far away, in order to make that department store patch through call to his parents, which he would only do once a month or as often as he could. Now, here is where it starts to get interesting. He finished his whole education. He became an engineer, but couldn't even take part in the graduation because he was under a false name, a false identity. There was no way that he could then assume his own identity to take the graduation and have the degree count for his continuation, for his career. And also being an orphan at the boarding school, he also didn't have any way to go to listen to the radio or to go to the movies or to pick up a newspaper. They actually had no idea what was going on in the sense of politically in the area. And though his parents somewhat did, so he went home to visit his parents after all these years that he was studying under an anonymous name, and he's still a kid. He's 17 years old now, and he goes back to his parents' house and finds the house completely empty. So he changes into his pajamas and goes to sleep in his childhood bed. Well, the reason his parents weren't there is because they had heard the whispers of the neighborhood folk, because he happened to come home on the night that was Kristallnacht, the night that the Hitlerjugend, the Nazi groups, were coming through and taking people and bashing windows. That's why it's called Kristallnacht, the night that the windows were broken. And they dragged him out of his bed and beat him to a pulp. And then after that starts the story that we've heard a few, I can't say too many times, but we've heard the same story again and again from survivors. The funny thing is, even as Eddie Jaku says in his book, is that many survivors chose not to talk about it. Part of their post-traumatic uh, uh, grieving or catharsis was to not talk about it, to not subject anyone else to the stories of what they had gone through. He, in fact, goes through the whole story of how he lived under a false identity for some time and how he was able to escape some precarious situations, how he was sent to Auschwitz, how his parents were killed, and how he had to really survive for his life. In fact, that the education that his father had insisted he take, and that he went to that boarding school, that even though he couldn't claim the identity of the boy who got the degree, in fact, being in Auschwitz, actually having that engineering background probably saved his life because he was considered indispensable. He was considered valuable because of his knowledge. And he was able to work in factories chained to the machine as a slave laborer. But even the slave labor that he did was preferable to being stuck in the camps during the day and having to be subject to what was happening in Auschwitz. So he was actually on loan to some of the factories, or meaning that there were working groups leaving Auschwitz every day to go to these factories, serving the war uh, facilities, so creating weapons and all sorts of military equipment. Just an incredible, incredible story. And while that part of the book is so heart wrenching and just unimaginable, where it does start to take an optimistic look, and having been the happiest man on earth, is the premise of the book. The promise is that he'd show you how to be the happiest man. And in fact, he does. He talks about uh, the happiness that he had in just knowing how much his parents loved him, even to the point that they couldn't be with him, even to the point that they did what was best for him. And the happiness that he felt once he left the camps, or the happiness that he felt when at one point he was recognized while he was chained to this factory uh, equipment. The factory owner came and said, I think I know you. I recognize you. And he remembered his father. The factory owner recognized Eddie's father as being just a great man, as a person who was a very upstanding citizen. They had actually served in the army together in World War One, and so while the factory owner couldn't break the law, or he would have been killed if he would have shown any mercy to Eddie Jaku, who was chained to this equipment. What the factory owner did do was put a little bit of food hidden into some of the equipment's crevices. And Eddie Jaku even said the food, in fact, was nothing that he could actually eat because it was so rich and he had had such a poor diet up until then that if he would eat, he would throw it up. If he would drink the milk or eat the cheese, or the sausage, he would throw it up. He wouldn't be able to digest it, and then obviously the Nazi officers who were watching him would wonder where this food came from. So he in fact would leave the food or spill the food into the machinery in a way that could be that wouldn't be detectable. But he said the kindness was enough to feed his soul. The kindness of other people taking the will and the time to try to help someone for no other benefit than that their heart compelled them to. That fed him more than the food ever would. So finding the appreciation, finding the good people, those are some of the strategies of being the happiest man on earth. And the biggest thing, the biggest uh, critical sort of the climax of the story of how he became the happiest man on earth, because he talks about after the war, through some incredible trials and tribulations, he actually was able to survive through the war. And after the war, he fell in love and he got married. And he said this, that even with that, he was still miserable and he was still depressed. And he just found himself a beautiful union with his wife, who had, in her own way, gone through her own trials and tribulations, but she hadn't gone to the camps. So he didn't want to trouble her. He didn't want to put the weight on her of what he had seen, because he wanted her to remain happy. He wanted to see her thrive and he didn't want to see her sad. And so while he was so happy to be married to this incredibly happy woman, he didn't want to burden her. And so he himself was very sad. Though he says when they had their first child, he didn't know happiness could exist. And in that instant, everything that came before was vanished, was erased, was today was a new start the moment he had his first child. And he goes on to describe that when they had their second child, while he didn't feel that he could in any way be as happy as he was with the first child, the second child proved him wrong. Uh, and yet he still didn't talk about his experience. He says that even years later, after he had emigrated to Australia and at first built a garage where he was a mechanic using his engineering skills, he created a car shop where he and his wife worked, where he did the engineering or the mechanics of it, she did the bookkeeping. And then even as he got older and they transitioned their lives to become real estate agents or own a real estate company in Australia, even as his kids grew, he still didn't speak about it until he was asked in his older age to speak about it, um, to start to tell his story. And so he did. But even as he's talking about it to rooms of people, auditoriums full of people, He couldn't talk about it with his own sons. And one day, after he had given a speech to a room full of strangers, his sons came out from behind the curtains of the stage, and they were crying because they've never actually heard that story before. And so then he started to understand that people need to hear his story, that what he went through, the darkness that he went through, had to come out into the light. And that's how we heal, and that's how we grow, and that's how we become the happiest man or woman on earth. He went on to give a TEDx talk that became a viral sensation, which followed up with the need for this book. When I got my hands on this book, I read it and I posted on Facebook that I had read it and the impact it had on me. And I was committed to making his book become a viral sensation, a best-selling book before his 102nd birthday, to which a friend of mine responded that he had just died a few days previous. In fact, he died on the day that I read this book. So I am still as committed as I was then to have this book become a bestseller, to have this book in the hands of every single person, whether you want to know or have experience with the Auschwitz story or not, whether you want to just read a very compelling memoir, or whether you want to learn how you too can be the happiest person on earth in spite of some of the most tragic difficulties, the most gruesome time throughout human history. The happiest man on earth on the Richter scale gets a 10.9 on the Richter scale. Until next time, see you soon.